Leo woke with a start, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He was no longer in his bed, but instead standing in the middle of a vast desert. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and dry, as if the earth itself had been scorched by something far beyond a mere flame. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as though some unseen force was holding him in place. The sky above was an unnatural shade of gray. Swirling clouds moved like a vortex, their shapes morphing and shifting with no discernible pattern. A low hum vibrated in the air, like the drone of 1,000 voices whispering just beyond his comprehension. Leo could feel the presence of something watching him from all around, though he could see no one. His heart raced. He tried to call out, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness that surrounded him. There was no wind, no sound, just the oppressive silence and the sense of being utterly alone. For a brief moment, he wondered if he was still dreaming. It made sense. He hadn't slept well in weeks, his mind tangled in endless thoughts of guilt and regret. But the clarity of the desert landscape, the sharpness of every detail, made him question whether this was truly a dream at all. Suddenly, he heard footsteps, faint but unmistakable. They came from the horizon, slow and deliberate, as if someone were approaching from a great distance. His instinct was to run, but something stopped him. It was as if his body refused to obey his commands, as if the desert itself had a hold on him. The figure in the distance grew closer. It was a woman dressed in white, her face obscured by a veil. She moved with a graceful, almost ethereal quality, as though she were floating above the ground rather than walking on it. Her presence felt oddly familiar, yet distant, like a memory he could almost grasp but couldn't fully remember. She stopped when she was just a few feet away from him, her eyes hidden beneath the veil. Her silence spoke volumes, and Leo felt a strange pull towards her, an overwhelming urge to reach out. Without thinking, he extended his hand toward her. But the moment his fingers brushed against her skin, the world around him shattered. The desert vanished, replaced by a dark, oppressive void. The ground beneath him disappeared, and he plummeted into the darkness. Leo stood in the middle of the living room, his chest tight, heart pounding in his ears. This was his childhood home. He could recognize the faded wallpaper, the old, worn furniture, but there was something deeply wrong about it. The air was thick with a stale, musty scent, as though no one had lived here for years. The walls, once comforting and familiar, now loomed over him, oppressive and dark. The warm, welcoming atmosphere of his youth had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of decay and despair. He took a hesitant step forward, the creak of the floorboards beneath his weight echoing through the silence. Every corner of the room felt wrong. The furniture was overturned, as though something or someone had violently torn through it. The photographs on the walls were distorted, their edges frayed and curling, the faces of his family members unrecognizable. Leo's gaze was drawn to the photographs scattered across the floor. Some were from his childhood, others from his adult life moments that should have been comfort. But as he knelt to pick one up, he froze. It was a photograph of himself as a young boy sitting at the kitchen table. But the boy in the photo had a twisted, contorted expression, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth was open, as if screaming for help. Leo felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't how he remembered this photo. He dropped the picture, his breath shallow and panicked. A noise from upstairs caught his attention, a faint thumping, as if someone were walking. His heart skipped a beat. He knew no one was supposed to be here, yet the sound grew louder. Someone or something was moving above him. Despite every instinct telling him to leave, Leo found himself heading toward the staircase. The air grew heavier with each step, the house seeming to stretch unnaturally around him. The familiar creak of the stairs felt jarring, like an intrusion, disturbing the fragile silence that had settled over the house. At the top of the stairs, he stopped. There, at the end of the hallway, was a door half open, its dark interior barely visible. The whispering footsteps were louder now, closer. Something was waiting for him on the other side. Hook. Leo stepped toward the door, his breath caught in his throat. As he reached for the handle, a cold gust of wind swept through the hallway, extinguishing the lights in the house, plunging him into complete darkness. Leo's hand trembled as he reached for the door. The temperature in the hallway had dropped drastically, and he could feel the weight of the silence pressing against him. The footsteps above him had stopped, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He hesitated, unsure whether to push the door open or retreat back to the stairs. But the door seemed to call to him. With a sense of inevitability, he turned the handle and slowly pushed it open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the light coming from a single, flickering candle on a wooden table. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with dusty, old books whose spines were too faded to read. The air smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Leo stepped inside, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but this room felt strangely familiar. It was as if he had been here before, long ago, but could not recall when. Suddenly, a low voice broke the silence. It wasn't the voice of a person, but something deeper, more primal. The sound echoed in the room, reverberating off the walls, as if the very space itself was alive. "Why did you come back?" the voice asked, its tone both menacing and mournful. Leo spun around, but there was no one there. His heart raced, and his breath quickened. The voice seemed to come from all around him, not from a single source. It was in the air, in the walls, in the very fabric of the room. He couldn't escape it. "I had to," Leo whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the voice or to himself. A loud bang sounded from behind him. Leo spun around just in time to see a figure darting out of the corner of his vision. It was gone before he could make out any details, just a blur of movement, a shadow that melted into the walls. Hook. Before he could process what had happened, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside the room with no way out. The door that had slammed shut behind Leo felt like an iron wall, and no matter how hard he tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. His body trembled with a mix of fear and frustration. He had no choice but to face whatever the room was hiding. The flickering candle on the table cast unsettling shadows across the room, distorting the furniture and creating eerie shapes on the walls. In the far corner, Leo noticed something that hadn't been there before, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was carved with intricate patterns, the wood darkened by age. The glass was cloudy, almost as if it had been untouched for decades. As Leo approached the mirror, a strange sensation gripped his chest, a feeling of both dread and curiosity. He had to look. He didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to peer into its depths. The reflection that stared back at him wasn't his own, at least not entirely. It was his face, but it was twisted in a grotesque way. His eyes were wide with terror, his mouth twisted into a mocking grin. Leo's reflection seemed to move on its own, independent of his own actions. It stared at him with a look of recognition, as though it knew something Leo didn't. "You're not real," Leo muttered under his breath, stepping back from the mirror. But the reflection didn't stop smiling. It spoke in a voice that was not his own. "Then who are you?" Leo's heart raced as his reflection's grin widened. The air around him grew colder, the shadows in the room deepening, as if the mirror itself were swallowing the light. "Hook." The reflection's smile twisted into something darker, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "I know everything about you," it whispered. "And soon you'll know everything about me." Leo stumbled backward, his heart thumping in his chest as the reflection's sinister grin seemed to burn into his very soul. His hands trembled as they pressed against the cold mirror, but the surface offered no comfort, no release. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, yet something kept him rooted to the spot. The reflection, still grinning with its unnerving smile, slowly lifted its hand and pressed it against the glass. The same movement Leo made, mirroring him. But when his reflection spoke again, it wasn't a mere echo. It was a command, a beckoning. "You can't escape, Leo," it whispered, its voice low and filled with malice. "Not until you solve the riddle of this place. Not until you face what you've buried inside yourself." Leo's blood ran cold. What did it mean? Solve the riddle. He was already lost, disoriented in a world where nothing was what it seemed. The mirror had already shattered the little bit of reality he had left. But before he could make sense of it, the air around him seemed to grow heavier. The walls of the room began to shift, distorting like ripples in water. The floor tilted, and suddenly, Leo found himself standing in front of an enormous iron gate. It was as if the mirror had opened into another dimension entirely. Behind the gate was nothing, just a swirling abyss of darkness. A deep voice echoed from the void, a presence too vast to be understood. You seek the truth, but truth is not given lightly. Answer my riddle, and you may pass. Fail, and you will remain here, lost forever. Leo's stomach twisted. The voice did not sound like anything human. It reverberated in his very bones. There was something ancient, something primordial in it, as if the gate itself had existed before time had begun. I have no life, but I grow. I do not have lungs, but I need air. I do not have a mouth, yet I can drown you. What am I? The riddle hung in the air like a thick fog, filling the space with its oppressive weight. Leo's mind raced. He had heard riddles like this before, cryptic, elusive, but this one felt different. It felt as though it wasn't just a puzzle to be solved, but a test of his very essence. His pulse quickened as he scanned his surroundings. The gate was massive, towering over him. The abyss beyond it seemed to call to him, pulling him in with an almost hypnotic force. For a long moment, he considered turning back, running away, but something deep inside him told him that this was the only way out. There was no turning back from this. He had to face whatever came next. But the riddle, the answer, was elusive. Leo closed his eyes, trying to concentrate. His mind was a storm of racing thoughts, memories flooding him. The feeling of drowning, of being swallowed by something immense, something larger than himself, felt familiar. But how? Then it hit him. Fire, Leo said, his voice hoarse, unsure but firm. The world seemed to freeze. The wind that had been swirling around him died down, and the darkness beyond the gate fell silent. The iron bars of the gate trembled, as if considering answer. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the deep voice spoke again, this time quieter, more satisfied. Correct? The gate groaned and slowly began to open, revealing a path that led into the abyss. But Leo didn't feel relief. The darkness that lay ahead felt suffocating, and as the gate creaked open, a terrifying sense of inevitability filled him. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The path beyond the gate was narrow, winding through what appeared to be a vast and endless tunnel. It was as if he was walking through the belly of some monstrous entity, the walls slick and covered in a strange, pulsating substance that oozed faintly in the darkness. Leo's footsteps were the only sound in the crushing silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him, something far worse than the fear gnawing at his insides. The darkness seemed to shift around him, and every time he glanced back, the path behind him was different, distorted in a way that defied logic. The further he walked, the more disoriented he became. His memories began to warp, as if the path itself was unraveling his mind. He saw flashes of his past, his childhood home, his family, but they weren't as he remembered them. They were fractured, shattered into 1,000 pieces. His mother's face, once warm and loving, was now cold and lifeless, her eyes hollow, staring at him with a look of pure disappointment. Leo staggered, feeling the weight of her gaze like a physical blow. His heart clenched, and he tried to push the vision away, but it only grew stronger, more vivid. He had to move forward. There was no time to dwell on the past. But the path kept changing, the walls warping with every step. He began to hear voices, whispers at first, faint and distant. They seemed to call his name, beckoning him deeper into the darkness. But the voices didn't sound like anything familiar. They were alien, distorted, as if the very fabric of his mind was being torn apart. He reached out to steady himself against the walls, but his fingers sank into the pulsating flesh-like material. He recoiled, his stomach churning, but the sensation was too real. Everything around him felt real, too real, as though he were trapped in a nightmare with no escape. "Help me," a voice whispered behind him. Leo spun around, but there was no one there. His breath caught in his throat, his body frozen in terror. The voice had been so close, and yet there was nothing. He had heard it, he knew he had, but it didn't make sense. Then he saw something that sent a chill crawling down his spine. In the distance, the tunnel opened up into a large chamber, but it wasn't an ordinary room. The walls were covered in mirrors, countless mirrors, reflecting distorted versions of himself. Some were smiling, some crying, some twisting in agony. And then, in the center of the chamber, Leo saw something that made his blood run cold, his own reflection. But it wasn't him. It was a twisted version of himself, standing in the middle of the room, staring directly at Leo with a cold, empty gaze. Its lips parted into a smile that was all too familiar. "Welcome to your truth," it whispered. Leo's legs trembled as he took a step toward the reflection. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to stop, to turn away and run. But something inside him, something dark, compelled him to move forward. The closer he got to the reflection, the more the mirrors around him seemed to distort. The room began to pulse, the walls breathing in and out as if alive. The reflections of Leo in the mirrors became more and more erratic, some of them vanishing into the glass, while others twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes. The air around him felt thick with a presence that wasn't his own. He could feel it. It was watching him. He reached the center of the room, where the twisted version of himself stood waiting. Its face was a mockery of his own, a smile stretched too wide, eyes black and empty. The reflection spoke again, its voice mocking. "You've been running, Leo, running from the truth, running from your past. But you can't hide anymore." Leo's heart raced as he faced the reflection. It was him, but it wasn't. This version of him was a hollow shell, a puppet, its strings pulled by something far greater than Leo could understand. "I am what you fear the most," the reflection hissed, stepping closer. "I am your guilt, your shame, the darkness that you buried deep inside. And now you have no choice but to face me." Leo's pulse pounded in his ears, his chest tightening with every word. The room around him felt suffocating, the air thick with dread. There was no escape, there was no way out. Hook, the twisted reflection, reached out and touched his arm, sending a shock of cold through Leo's body. Suddenly, his vision warped, and the room began to crumble around him, pulling him into the abyss once more. The ground trembled beneath Leo's feet as the twisted reflection reached out, its cold fingers brushing his arm. The touch sent a shockwave of freezing terror through his entire body, and for a brief moment he felt as though his very soul was being ripped from him. His chest constricted, and he gasped for air as the room around him began to disintegrate into nothingness. The mirrors shattered into jagged fragments, floating like shards of glass suspended in midair. The air was thick with the scent of decay and the distant echoes of his own name, whispered in mocking tones. He stumbled back, his feet sliding on the now crumbling floor, but the reflection didn't move. It remained frozen in place, its mocking grin widening with each step Leo took backward. The ground under his feet continued to collapse, turning into a swirling vortex of blackness that seemed to consume everything in its path. "This is the end, Leo," the reflection purred, its voice a low, almost soothing whisper. "There is no escape. You cannot outrun your past. Your sins will follow you forever. They are a part of you." Leo's heart raced in his chest, pounding so loudly that it nearly drowned out the voice of his reflection. His mind spun in a frenzy. Was it true? Could he really escape what he had done? Was this nightmare his punishment, an eternal prison where the guilt and pain of his past would consume him forever? Suddenly, he felt the tug of something deep within him. It wasn't just the reflection, not just the nightmare world surrounding him. It was a memory, a forgotten moment buried in the recesses of his mind. Something that had happened long ago, a moment of betrayal, a decision that had shattered everything. Without thinking, he reached into the pocket of his jacket, his hand trembling. He pulled out the small, ancient artifact that had first led him into this nightmare, an old, intricately carved key, its metal gleaming in the fractured light. It was cold to the touch, its surface covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change as he stared at them. The reflection's grin faltered when it saw the key in Leo's hand. "No," it hissed, its voice tinged with panic. "You can't use that. It won't save you. It can't save you." Leo felt a strange sense of power surge through him as he held the key in his palm. He could feel the weight of it, both in the physical sense and in the way it seemed to anchor him to some distant truth. The key was not just an object, it was a bridge, a way back to the reality he had lost, a path to understanding, to redemption. With trembling hands, Leo stepped toward the reflection. His body felt light, as though the world around him was slipping through his fingers, but the key in his hand burned with an intensity that anchored him to the moment. The reflection began to distort, its features blurring, its mocking smile turning into a grotesque grimace of rage. "You think you can escape me?" The reflection screamed, its voice cracking with anger. "You can never escape. You are me. I am you." Leo didn't listen. He didn't need to. The key was the only thing that mattered now. With a force that surprised even him, Leo thrust the key toward the reflection, his arm shaking with the effort. The key's surface flared with a blinding light, and as it made contact with the reflection, the entire room exploded into a cacophony of noise-shattering glass, howling wind, and the deafening sound of Leo's heart hammering in his chest. When Leo's vision cleared, he found himself standing on the edge of a cliff. The sky above was an unnatural hue of black and violet, the clouds swirling like a storm of endless despair. Below, a vast chasm yawned wide, its depths shrouded in an impenetrable darkness. The wind howled around him, but the ground beneath his feet was solid, cold stone. He looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. This place felt real, but it also felt like something else. A space between spaces. A liminal world where time had no meaning and reality was shaped by the fractured pieces of his mind. "This is it," a voice whispered, its tone softer now, more familiar. It was the voice of the reflection, but it no longer sounded mocking. Instead, it was filled with something else, something Leo couldn't quite place. Regret? He spun around, searching for the source of the voice. In the distance, standing just beyond the edge of the cliff, was the figure of a man. His features were obscured by shadows, but Leo could see the outline of a tall, thin figure. The man's posture was rigid, almost statuesque, as though waiting for something. "Who are you?" Leo demanded, his voice shaking with both fear and anger. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The figure remained silent for a long time. Then slowly it spoke. "I am the keeper of truth. I am the one who watches over all the fragments you have discarded." Leo felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean, fragments? What are you talking about?" The keeper's voice grew louder, more powerful, and with it, the winds around Leo picked up, whipping his hair and clothes into a frenzy. "You, Leo, are lost. You've been running from the truth for so long that you no longer know who you are. Your mind has fragmented into pieces, each part of you a broken shard of the person you once were." Leo took a step back. "No, that's not true. I'm not broken. Are you sure?" The keeper's voice echoed like a thunderclap. "Then tell me, Leo, why have you been consumed by guilt, by fear, by regret? Why does the weight of your past haunt you at every turn?" Leo's stomach churned. He wanted to deny it, wanted to scream at the keeper for twisting his words. But deep down, he knew it was true. He had been running from the truth of what he had done, from the decisions he had made, from the people he had hurt. A memory, distant and painful, flashed before his eyes. The night of the accident, the night he had lost everything, the moment he had betrayed the one person who had trusted him. The weight of that guilt had festered within him, like a cancer, eating away at his very soul. He had buried it all beneath layers of lies, distraction, and denial. I didn't mean to hurt them," Leo whispered, his voice breaking. "I never wanted this." The keeper stepped forward, his face still obscured by the shadows. "It doesn't matter what you intended, Leo. The truth is inescapable. It is the thing that shapes you, molds you, and, in the end, it will either break you or set you free." The ground beneath Leo's feet cracked, the cliff edge crumbling away into the abyss below. The wind screamed in his ears, but the keeper's voice remained unwavering. "Only you can choose. Only you can face the truth." Leo stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The cliff seemed to stretch endlessly beneath him, the abyss pulling at him with an unrelenting force. He couldn't turn back. Not now. He had come too far, and there was no going back from the truth. As he moved closer to the edge, the keeper's voice reverberated in his mind. "This is your moment, Leo. Will you face your past? Will you confront the guilt, the shame, the fear that has haunted you all your life?" Leo's breath caught in his throat. Every step he took toward the chasm was like a step toward the deepest part of himself, a place where all his darkest secrets were buried. But he had to face them. He had to confront the pain that had shaped him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and when he opened them again, he saw the face of the person he had betrayed. They stood before him, their eyes filled with sorrow, but there was no anger, only a quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," Leo whispered, his voice trembling. And as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the world around him began to shift. The dark sky, the endless chasm, the keeper, they all began to fade, replaced by a light so bright, so pure, that Leo felt himself being pulled into it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Leo felt at peace. He had faced the truth, and in doing so, had found redemption. Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.